Hey everyone, it's Azima here for Shacknews. Let's take some time today to talk about Final Fantasy VII Remake, shall we? What can we say about Final Fantasy VII that hasn't already been said? It's considered by many to be one of the greatest video games of all time, featuring one of the most captivating stories ever seen in an RPG. And by all indicators, Final Fantasy VII Remake looks to have been everything fans of the original hoped for. It took an adventure built on the primitive PlayStation 1 and turned it into a modern epic worthy of modern machines. We've heard from many people in gaming who went in guns blazing comparing Remake to the original, but we haven't heard a lot of prominent voices who've never played the original Final Fantasy VII. And if you think I'm that voice, then I hate to break it to you, but I've never been considered prominent. However, it is true that I've never played the original Final Fantasy VII, so I want to take today to talk about 5 of the most impactful moments in Final Fantasy VII Remake to hit me, a Final Fantasy VII newbie. So I know a lot about Final Fantasy VII, but I don't know the story intimately. I definitely don't know the ins and outs of the original narrative. But I will say this, the opening chapter was the coolest way to hook me in. Starting with Cloud riding on a train and all the way through taking down a giant mech to pave the way for a massive reactor explosion, Final Fantasy VII Remake started with a big action movie feel to it. But from there it doesn't take long to see that the reactor explosion had a very real impact on the surrounding area. There's people's terrified expressions, their concern for whether their loved ones might have been near the explosion, there's a real uncertainty about what's coming next. It all put a real human face on Avalanche's war, and set the stage for a full-scale adventure to come. When the story starts, it's just Cloud riding in, and again I want to emphasize, he's riding in on a train looking as badass as possible. Like, he's riding in like this is another job. But by the end of Chapter 2, you know you're in for something far greater than that. And speaking of Cloud, let's talk about him for a second. So I walked into Final Fantasy VII Remake knowing little about Cloud, aside from the obvious. He's a soldier with a big spiky haircut who carries a big honking sword. I didn't get the big deal with him, but over the course of the game, I learned. And one of the things I came to notice is that Cloud's a bit of a ladies' man. There are so many instances of women coming onto Cloud over the course of the game, and they happen almost right away. Yes, I expected Aerith. Yes, I expected Tifa. I wasn't quite expecting Jessie, and that's because from what I've heard, she doesn't have a big role in the original game. But here she is, fawning over Cloud from the moment he saved her life in Chapter 1. Yeah, Tifa's making him drinks, Aerith's giving him flowers, Jessie wants to make him pizza. And Cloud appears to be the object of a lot of women's desires. But what really struck me about Cloud was that he never reciprocated with any of them. Sure, there are moments in the game that can be interpreted as romantic, like the sewer scene where the player has to decide whether to help Tifa or Aerith up first, but Cloud never seems like he's into any of the women in his life. And that led me to wonder, is Cloud an asexual character? I went through the whole game observing his lack of romantic interest in anybody, his awkward romantic interactions, and even his scene with Don Corneo. Cloud doesn't even pretend to have a shred of romantic interest in anybody, and it's not that he's completely devoid of emotion. You start to see his emotional connections with his friends come out throughout the story, especially towards the end. But romantic and sexual desire? That's not Cloud! And that makes him fascinating to me. I'm hard-pressed to find any asexual representation in pop culture as a whole. BoJack Horseman's Todd Chavez is really the only character that comes to mind. The field gets even thinner in video games, and Cloud as a potential asexual icon feels like a big deal for a sector of people who may otherwise feel invisible. Representation does matter, and even if Square doesn't necessarily acknowledge Cloud as asexual, the idea that he can be interpreted that way feels important, and it feels like a big step forward for video games and video game narratives.
You don't want to get mixed up with a guy like me. I'm a loner, Daddy. A rebel. So long, Dad.
Having said all of this, I want to end this point by reiterating my exposure to Cloud Strife has been minimal. I know of him in this game, and I know what I've seen of him from his limited Kingdom Hearts cameos. But now that I've experienced his story in full, well, mostly in full anyway, I've seen his incredible character development. This is a guy who started off as a money-driven mercenary, clocking in and out with as few human connections as possible. And as the story went on, he discovered more about himself, he connected more with the people he worked with, who eventually became his friends, he learned to help others, and he learned that he had a greater purpose in this world. And he did it all without losing a shred of what makes him a strong, fearsome warrior. He's a true badass, and I can totally see why so many people latch onto him now. I get it with Cloud. He is awesome. So I want to go back to the idea of representation for a minute. When I saw the trailers for the dance number at the Honeybee Inn, and later saw the images of Cloud sporting makeup and a dress, I didn't know quite what to expect. I will say I thought there would be some semblance of mockery towards it, maybe a little bit of mean-spiritedness, because let's face it, video games hasn't exactly treated that kind of subject matter with respect. But not only does Final Fantasy Remake play those scenes earnestly, it does treat them with far more respect than I ever expected. There was a full scene of Cloud dancing with Andrea Rodea, and there was no mockery to it, there were no dumb jokes, there were no ill attempts at cruel humor. Yeah, Cloud wasn't thrilled about doing it, but he did what he had to do for the sake of the mission, and everybody in the club cheered him on. And while Andrea can be interpreted as an eccentric, they're also the type of character that you don't see often in video games, one who can be seen as truly gender fluid. But the game doesn't mock that, it doesn't even dwell on it. In Final Fantasy VII, a gender fluid person like Andrea is not only normal, but also one that can rise to power while living their best life. Everything about this dance scene at the Honeybee Inn felt positive, and it even felt empowering. The dress scene feels similar in that it could have been made something for people to laugh at. Oh look, it's a hard-ass soldier Cloud and he's wearing a dress. Isn't that wacky? But it's not played for laughs. Again, it's played as Cloud doing what he has to do for the mission and also to save his friend. And yes, Tifa thinks about making a joke at his expense, but Cloud shuts it down so fast and the idea is immediately dropped. The game doesn't dwell on this, it doesn't make you think about it too much, it doesn't poke fun at it or anything like that. It plays the scene straight, and if anybody comes across as somebody to be mocked, it's Don Corneo for being such a pig. And it doesn't take long for Cloud to put him in his place anyway. I absolutely love the Honeybee Inn dance number, and I love the dress scene. And honestly, it's one of the most unique scenes I've ever seen in a video game, and it probably is one of my favorite parts of the game as a whole. I wasn't sure what to expect when it came time to save Sector 7 from Shinra's plan to bring down the giant plate. Like the reactor scene at the start of the game, I expected mile-a-minute action. And granted, I got that, very much so, but what I didn't expect was to be so emotionally devastated by the time it was all over. A big part of that was because of how well developed the Avalanche trio was. You went on a secret mission with them, you fought side by side with Wedge, you rendezvoused with Biggs later down the line, you rode with Jessie on a motorcycle and she's putting her arms around Cloud. You even had dinner with all of them and met Jessie's family. You got to know all of these characters. You learned about Biggs and his time at the orphanage, you learned about Wedge and his love for cats, you learned about Jessie's theater aspirations and how she put all of that aside to fight for her ailing father. So when you start to climb up the plate controls and these characters you've come to know start dying, it feels soul-crushing. It's an emotional stomach punch. And it's so moving that it's one of the first moments in the game where Cloud starts to express real emotion. Now no, Cloud doesn't get overly emotional. He understands at the end of the day that this is war, and war has casualties. But Cloud also came to know these people, and has considered them colleagues, if not friends. Jessie's death hit me especially hard given her character arc. You've seen her try and make amends for the first reactor's explosion. Yes, we learned that it was ultimately Shinra that made the explosion bigger than it was, but Jessie genuinely believed it was her fault. She felt guilty over it, and she vowed to do better. You've met her parents. You've even made a pizza date with her. So by the time she's dying and Tifa is crying over her dead body, it's hard not to cry the way she does. But as hard as these deaths hit, it sets up some legitimate shocks at the end of the story. Especially when we talk about Sephiroth. From everything I'm told about the original Final Fantasy VII, Sephiroth doesn't take a particularly active role in the story until much later. So some people were surprised to see the big bad rear his ugly head throughout the story. And yes, he ends up being the final boss for this game, even though we're not anywhere close to the end of this story. But as somebody who's new to Final Fantasy VII myself, I started to grasp what's going on, and I can appreciate the story that Square is trying to tell here. This remake introduced Whispers, and they're basically Harry Potter Dementor-like looking things that show up all over the story, and players eventually learn that their purpose is to keep Destiny in line. It's why Sephiroth wasn't allowed to kill Barret. It's why Wedge was ultimately shoved out a window to his apparent death. Destiny has to run its course, right? But if Sephiroth is as powerful as everybody is making him out to be, then there's every reason to believe that he knows how Destiny is going to play out. He has to know that in the end, he's destined to lose. But what if he alters that destiny? What if he can get Cloud and his friends to wipe out the Whisperers so that there's nothing to keep Destiny in line anymore? What happens when Sephiroth's destiny to lose is no longer a certainty? And I've heard people decry the ending, and I can understand that, especially people who played the original game. This is supposed to be Final Fantasy VII Remake, not Final Fantasy VII Reboot. This is supposed to be Square Enix expanding on the original story, not taking liberties and trying to alter it. But as somebody who doesn't have ties to that original story, I love this. I'm not expecting Square Enix to pull a Star Trek and completely change everything, but with Sephiroth manipulating the forces of destiny, it adds an element of uncertainty that makes the rest of the story a lot more interesting. We're already starting to see what happens when destiny is modified. I didn't play the original game, but I'm pretty sure Biggs isn't supposed to be alive at the end of this. And I feel like that's just going to scratch the surface of what could change. So what else is going to happen down the road? What happens when Aerith dies? Does Aerith die? Does she die later? Do any of the other characters die? The Final Fantasy VII timeline will probably still unfold as intended, but it's not fixed anymore, and that adds an extra degree of intrigue to the next chapter, whenever that may come. And those are the 5 most impactful moments to me of Final Fantasy VII New Leaf. If you want more on Final Fantasy VII Remake, we have guides and walkthroughs on our website, as well as many more videos here on our YouTube channel, so be sure to like and subscribe. And for all things video games, you're in the right place. This is Shacknews.com.